the Healing Circle podcast. I'm Jezere.
I'm Lauren Zakia.
And I'm E. Nicole.
We are faculty and fellows at InPower Institute, which is a center for community healing and optimal living.
Our podcast series, InPower Healing Circle, marks the 400th anniversary of the first Africans who arrived as captives in this country.
Today we'll center our discussion around the theme, 400 years of disembodiment separates us from pleasure. It's time to heal, y'all. Circle up.
Hey, I say to that.
Shay.
So how has our violation distanced us from pleasure?
I think the legacy of trauma, one of the first things that is a result from that is that our bodies are the place where pain constantly resides. So if I am in constant pain, whether that's physical, emotional, spiritual, then I may come to relate to my body as a place where pain is inflicted. And that in and of itself distances us from even knowing what pleasure is, or the fullness that we could experience as it relates to pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. And you literally, even knowing what pleasure is. So one of the first things I thought from this question, how has our violation distanced us from pleasure, is that it's redefined pleasure. And to now pleasure is whenever, I bet if anyone listening, when they first heard the word pleasure, maybe you all can comment back to us on our social media platforms, but what images pop into your head? And a lot of times the image and the notion of pleasure has been distorted. And so it's like, what does that even mean for me? And I feel like now it's the way that it's distanced us is like pleasure is it's a privilege to have pleasure. But that is unnatural for it to be something that's privileged. And so, I feel like a lot of times I'm thinking of people in my family, especially maybe even like some of the women and older women have felt like pleasure was not theirs to have, that everyone else needed to experience pleasure before themselves.
I think that circles right back to that self-denial that we've previously discussed.
Episode 1.
And that is just not the case. I feel like pleasure is for everyone, no matter your income bracket or whatever demographic you might lie in. But the violation of our bodies, where we are I feel like a lot of times we're kind of on the outside looking in on the life that we're living or supposed to be leading. And so violation has the tendency to separate us even further from an existence that we should be thoroughly involved in. So when you are outside of yourself, you cannot see the good things, and pleasure to me is always associated with good things. But if I feel like I don't deserve it, then I can't really reconcile those two.
Yeah, I mean, I think of the term guilty pleasure.
Yeah.
If I have been conditioned to believe that pleasure is a privilege that I don't have access to, then I come to think that pleasure is bad. It's not something that I should look forward to. It's not something I should have access to, and so I push it away. Either intentionally or unintentionally.
Yeah, couple things. Y'all are always making my mind trigger. So, guilty pleasure, I feel like that is such a common icebreaker for teams. Like, whether it's like team building, activity, or whatever, blah, 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 or some type of new hire training. That is my pet peeve question of what's your guilty pleasure? I can't stand it, and I'm always that person that's like, I'm not guilty about the pleasure that I experience.
Right.
But it's automatically assumed that people are like, what? You mean it has to be something that you feel bad about, that you enjoy? And I'm like, oh my goodness. So like let's be clear. this is not about just the things that Black people experience. Everybody has this notion that we're supposed to feel bad about enjoyment.
Yeah.
I also wanted to circle back too on I mentioned as far as like with like I feel like I identified it and noticed it with like women in the family, like older women and everything like that, especially with this distance from pleasure, but also this distance from pleasure across the spectrum of gender. And so let's go with those who are either maybe masculine presenting or or maybe cisgender men who identify with being, masculine and everything like that. And I want to say maybe some of the traditional viewpoints of what masculinity is. That pleasure is something where I get to dominate something, whether that's through sport and hunting, or whether that's through sex, or whether that's through even work and the way that I am in meetings and things like that. And a lot of those notions do get adopted by other people as well. And so it's like, I think even if people who seem to have the privilege of so-called owning pleasure, I feel like the pleasure that is owned is not like necessarily, it's like still pleasure redefined.
I think a lot of it is tied up in control. Just thinking about what you said about masculine presenting or the cisgendered masculine people. I feel like a lot of that, their pleasure center is tied up in control. And that goes even beyond just like sexual, tangible pleasure. I've run across so many men who do not like receiving gifts. Like, they just feel like, I'm gonna give you a gift, and that's fine. That's enough. I'm
gonna buy you a drink.
I'm gonna buy you a drink. But Lord forbid I spend my $10 on some Douce for you. I'm
gonna grab your booty. Don't grab my booty.
Right. It's very much a control thing. Like, no, you can enjoy that. Like, if I want to get you something, you should be able to receive it and not feel any kind of way about it. This is not a violation towards you. This is me doing for you, and I want you to receive pleasure from this.
You gonna get your booty grabbed,
and you'll enjoy it.
Well, I think
with consent.
With consent.
Yeah. When pleasure has been understood as something that happens to us, not something that happens by us, then we're at the whim of somebody else. So if I am only experiencing pleasure because of what somebody gives me, then if they don't give me anything, then I don't have pleasure. And so we really have to think about pleasure from the sense of agency. Like, how do I give pleasure to myself? That way my pleasure is not wrapped up in your control or your actions,
or dependent
upon that. Because I think that is what has happened, that particularly in many people's identity, pleasure, if I've only been given pain, then that it's something that's external to me, somebody's doing to me, then I might be waiting for somebody to stop with the pain and start giving me pleasure, versus me saying pleasure is something that I can give to myself.
I was just thinking about the ways in which, like, when we start learning what pleasure is, and just thinking about, it happens earlier on with what we're told of what's pleasurable, and what's not, and also how we can voice our pleasures or not. And so my mind always goes to the children and how they're impacted. So
we tell children, like, children starts to find pleasure within themselves as they explore their own bodies. Now I'm talking specifically right now sexually, but the adults around them will say, no, like, that's you nasty. Don't have the right to give your own self pleasure. And so we take that on, and that can distance us from pleasure, because we're taught pleasure is not something you give yourself. It is what you wait for somebody else to give to you.
And you don't get that permission until you're much further along in life. And even then, that permission to pleasure yourself is sometimes met with the side eye depending on who you're talking to. Mm-hmm. But just in thinking about, you say you're thinking about the children and the youth, I automatically think of a Tony song that it feels good. Right. Yeah. I remember listening to that as a kid and I was like, this feels good. And so it's just like something as simple as a song, as a melody, as a beat, that's pleasurable for me. And I think sometimes even as an adult and thinking about childhood, pleasure can be simple. It doesn't have to be this complex, huge thing. It can be as simple as a good song. It can be as simple as a scent. It can be, honestly, as simple as thinking about old black women wearing white diamonds.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I know it's very specific.
White diamond perfume, Elizabeth Taylor.
Yeah, it's very specific.
Okay.
Child, that was my grandma was.
I was going to say,
like, exactly, but it's like old black women, and I smell that scent, and I feel safe. Right. I feel safe. I feel like, oh, this black woman is about to embrace me. Even if it's like a mean black woman, I feel like they're coming in peace, you know.
that white diamond dilutes.
It dilutes everything else. But yeah, it can be just a simple, straightforward type of thing. It doesn't have to be like we're doing this in secrecy. None of that. Mm-hmm. Pleasure is simple, straightforward. A good song, a scent, a piece of chocolate, something that simply makes you feel good.
I'm so glad you brought that up. As far as, that's another thing of how pleasure has been distorted and redefined and controlled, is that pleasure is, like, you can see when you drive down the highway. I just drove to Kansas City. Anytime that the word pleasure was public, it had 3 X's behind it and was like this. You saw a whole bunch of semis parked outside some little building, and there's something with men's spa room open with Susie or something like that on the side. And so, you know, pleasure is so much more, and it's so important that we remember as we member with ourselves, and also doing it to children. Because another thing, real quickly, if I can kick it back to children, we also in the beginning not just teach them about what pleasure they can have or can't have, but then also get them conditioned to having their pleasure and so much of their bodies being policed by someone else. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't necessarily get to shake for everyone later on, because then many people continue on getting used to that normalization of denial, that normalization of just honestly racialized shame as it shows up with our bodies, what we are allowed to experience and beyond our bodies with pleasure. So that's something that's, is worth pausing on, you know. Mm-hmm. But
I mean, the thing also that I wanted to lift up is, you know, when a violation happens, then that is an interruption to healthy forms of living. And so just that act is the site of, well, I said it, trauma. And so until that trauma is healed, then it will be very difficult to step on the other side of it where pleasure may lie. So the violation is an interruption to a healthy flow.
Mm-hmm. To our listeners, when you hear us get quiet, this is the time if you can just visualize, you know, just that deep pondering. Just kind of, you know, lean into that with us, because this is real. We're answering this very real.
Yeah. I'm personally thinking about my own ways in which I have been violated, and how fighting to really remember and reimagine pleasure was very difficult. Because even if I would inch toward pleasure, I was reminded of a painful moment. And I couldn't, it was like, it arrested me, like I couldn't move forward. And it was such a difficult time trying to be present again with my body, to love my body and to know that I was deserving and worthy of pleasure. Because the violation tricks you into believing that you're not worthy of it because you think that it's something that you did. And so if you believe it's something that you did, and this is a false, of course not true, then you will hold yourself back from really exploring and stepping out again.
What's on my mind right now is how much the violation of pleasure in one way can result in us seeking pleasure in another way. If we're continuously shut down and denied pleasure in, let's say, the first way. The reason why I'm bringing that up is I'm thinking about and I'll just put that out there. I'm thinking about one of the elders in my family who is no longer with us, who experienced a lot of violations and a lot of trauma as a result in regard to the pleasures of life in all forms, whether that be the pleasure of having the right amount of resources growing up. The pleasure of being able to just thrive as a kid, but then also in terms of the violations that occurred in relation to her body and her development in that way. And I know for a fact in speaking with her as I grew up that she then sought pleasure through overeating quite a bit. She was felt very disconnected from her body and even told me. Things happen, and then that's when you get fat. Was like the direct quote, which is not the case for everybody, but for this particular person, I'm just thinking about, and how critical it is when one is constantly and or very traumatically denied pleasure, and then it can go into something else that can be pleasurable there in the moment, but then at a certain point, one may end up reviolating. In different ways, and that's just like one example that comes to mind. Is that kind of making sense?
Yeah,
it is. It kind of makes me think of our next question, like how do we subjugate our own pleasure and that of others? To me, it sounds like your relative found the control in what she could find the control in. So all of these outliers and all these things happen to us. We couldn't control that. But what I can control is what I eat and how much I eat. This is not going to hurt me in the same way. So I can control this. So control, I think, plays a big part in receiving pleasure and giving pleasure and how it's perceived. And even thinking about that, you control like the gauge of pleasure that you receive. Like if you don't like it, you tell somebody stop. Or if you feel like you're not getting enough of it, you tell them to continue. Like we can unclog and clog this drain as much as we want to. And that's us exerting power over this pleasurable center that we find ourselves in. And that's for us and for those that we want to share pleasure with or to show pleasure to.
But I think when we have, so we talked about how the violation separates us, but we may not necessarily state this emphatically, but it's almost like pleasure is something that has to be rationed out. So you have to, even if we get away from the guilty pleasure, which we kind of talked about, that we don't see pleasure as an unlimited source that we can draw from. It's like, ooh, I'm going to save it. I'm going to save that pleasure because it might run out. So
three times a week.
That's going to be my Saturday.
Right.
15 times a month.
We ration out pleasure because...
Like a cell phone minutes back in the day.
Right.
Ain't got no rollover with that pleasure.
Right.
But I think that when we look at pleasure in a way that it's, like I said, it's unlimited, then we might find other ways and explore ways whether they're small ways or larger ways of just experiencing pleasure from day to day.
Just the simple things.
Yeah.
Not always having pleasure attached to sexual things or things of that nature. Pleasure could be like, oh man, I don't have to rush to work today. I mean, I got 8 hours of sleep. I woke up on time. I can watch a little trash TV and then go on about my day. You might find pleasure in that. Or I can stop and have coffee at a place that I don't normally get to go to because I'm generally rushing. Like, it's just finding pleasure in small things and not sacrificing yourself or waiting or putting pleasure on the back burner until Saturday, you know?
Yeah.
So my mind is kind of, the things that are on my mind kind of leads to the next question. So I want to pause. I don't know if you want to add anything else to the topic of why do we subjugate our own pleasure and that of others.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have anything else. I think we subjugate our own pleasure because we think that pleasure is limited. We subjugate our own pleasure because we don't think that we are often worthy of it. Yeah, we do that as well.
How do we do it to like that of others? Because I know we talked a lot about like our own pleasure, but I also don't want to, and I'm saying this like to myself, I don't want to skip over the fact of the times in which it may show up in me that I may do that to others, whether that be partner, whether that be friend, whether that be whoever, or even somebody on TV, even some, maybe even judging or whatever. You know, it can show up in so many ways.
I think judging is a good way to put it. I think a lot of it is tied to control. Because when I think about it, if I'm ever, throwing somebody a nasty side eye, it's probably because I don't have control over the situation. But they're doing whatever they want to do, and while it has no impacts on my life, I'm like, well, who told you could do that? Like, who said it was a good time for you to have some Cavassier? Like, and I can't have none,
Right.
So I think it's just, to me, it's that type of domination or lack of domination when we try to put that onto other people. Like, I can't do it, but like you can do it.
Let this person have an off day. I had to go to work, but you
right. So you salty, and I think that to me that's what it looks like. That's one of the ways it presents itself. You have the ability, the freedom, the liberation to do whatever it is that you're wanting to do to bring yourself pleasure. I do not have that same capability at this current moment. So I might say something, I might look at you a certain way, but it's only because I can't do what you're doing currently.
Right. Or I can, I just don't recognize it.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think that some people have a theology that suggests that God does not want you to experience pleasure. That pleasure is sin. And so we don't indulge in it because that's the way we understand ourselves in relationship with a divine being. I mean, I remember, on my journey, being a part of faith communities. Well, not me being a part of faith communities, but being in relationship with people who are part of faith communities where the rules were you couldn't dance, you couldn't go to parties, you couldn't wear this outfit, you couldn't do this, and it's like, things that are enjoyable and fun, it's like, no, those are all sin. And I remember I was at a wedding, and I'm a dancer. I grew up dancing ballet, tap, jazz, and all these other forms since 4. And so dancing is something that has always given me pleasure. But when I became a part of some faith communities, it was like, only the holy dances were what you should be doing.
With the ribbons.
Right? So I remember being at a wedding, and the song came on, and I was just getting it. And I remember this girl was in the wedding who was very judgmental. And I think she was very judgmental because when pleasure has been cut off from you, you are so bitter. Yeah. And you are so angry. You don't understand it. Now, it was masquerading as righteousness. But she was really angry and judgmental
she went
free. And I'm having
she admired you, didn't know how to
yeah.
express it.
Well, yeah, I was having a good time, and I saw her glare. It was like piercing. That I was like, wow. It was that intense because
I wouldn't want to find her uncle and have a good time. I'm raggedy.
Stop. Yeah.
That's
that on that.
Yeah. So that was her attempt of subjugating my pleasure.
Right.
With that look, like, you call yourself a Christian and look at you carrying on, having fun and dancing and bending over. And
see, what I like to think about, I listen to a lot of podcasts. There's one in particular I like. Her name, it's called Getting Grown. And one of the podcasters, her name is Dr. Kia. She always says, God is not going to play you.
Yeah.
And that is just something that I knew it, but to hear her like just synthesize it that quick, I was like, that's right. God is not going to play you. He didn't give you these yams. He didn't give you these cakes to just sit in a corner and not bake, Mm-hmm. So when people try to come at you like, oh, you shouldn't have fun, you shouldn't dance. Okay, that's you. That's how you interpret that book that you read.
Yeah.
How I interpret it is that, hey, my ancestors and the good Lord gave me these, and I'm going to experience life to my fullest capabilities and abilities. Mm-hmm. So can't nobody be mad but you. Yeah. You can't control this sphere of pleasure.
Yeah. And is that what it is? Really, a fear of pleasure. Pleasure has the ability to take you to the unknown. Pleasure, and I'm thinking about like ecstasy, and not just necessarily sexual ecstasy, but
drug.
Or yes, I mean it is a high in a way. Whatever the endorphins are released in our bodies when we experience pleasure, it can take us beyond ourselves, and because of the ways in which people have been controlled, there's a fear that if I don't manage everything in my life in a very rigid or very disciplined way, then I'm going to be in danger. It's not safe. And so the fear is, the response is to contain all of you.
Mm-hmm. Fear of freedom.
Yeah.
But yeah, I feel like pleasure is freedom. Mm-hmm. And that's why it can be experienced in so many different ways, mm-hmm. right? And so if everyone is free, then that means that you must let go too. Mm-hmm. And I feel like those who want to be in the most control ultimately are very, very, very afraid mm-hmm, mm-hmm. of no control.
Yeah.
Not so much in this being projected as fear of losing control over others, but it's really when you do seek to control someone. This goes for goes for parenting, goes from when you don't want to let go of your kids, growing up, and this goes to people in partnerships and other situations as well. But when you put so much of your energy into controlling another, you too are chained to that. So anyway, something to think about. So lastly, how do we reimagine and reclaim our pleasure?
Not asking for permission to enjoy pleasure or to experience pleasure, not rationing out our pleasure. I don't have to wait for Saturday. I can have it right now. Yeah. And I will take it right now. So thank you. I appreciate you for taking my TED Talk.
Thank you, and more, please.
Right. Not my TED Talk.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I had to really reconcile with my embedded theology that suggested I needed to restrain from pleasure because, it's sinful. So I had to reorient myself around a goddess who actively seeks to engage with me in the state of pleasure.
One of the ways that this has showed up for me, and this shows up for me, is remembering what I knew so strongly as a child. And so just play, running, laughing, anything. If it's silly, who cares? Well, that's childish to laugh at that. Nah, y'all, you farted. That was funny to me. But anyway, but then also too, like, it makes me think of, so a couple of years ago, I had started a fitness class called Adult Recess. And it's because I started recognizing that one of the true, like, I guess, illnesses or ailments is that adults have forgotten to play. Mm-hmm. Adults have forgotten and have been conditioned to, take themselves too seriously. Mm-hmm. And, like, working out has to be da-da-da-da and all this other stuff. Or just their lives in general. And so what if we just spent our time laughing?
Yeah.
Like, and just cracking the hell up. Yeah. And that in and of itself, to redefine fitness, redefine pleasure, mm-hmm. redefine freedom, that's healing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think being pleased with yourself is one of the ways that you reimagine pleasure, because there's so much, guilt and shame and condemnation around our humanity, that we have to learn how to be pleased with ourselves. I remember, I think it was 7th grade, there was a poster I got from school that I hung in my wall, and I didn't know the totality of this statement, but in my soul, I knew that was an aspiration that I wanted to hold dear to me. And it said, true happiness is when you can look in the mirror and like what you see. And it was such a simple statement, but I thought, if I could reach that goal, then how much pleasure will I experience in life? Mm-hmm. That I don't have to constantly look at myself and hate who I am, how I look, how I function. Like, if I can love myself fully, then I can fully engage in pleasure and it not be guilty.
Mm. I agree. I think that's a good period to this pleasure conversation.
Yeah.
But we want to invite you all to rediscover and reimagine and reclaim your pleasure. So join us on November 9th at the InPower Institute for an intimate experience with other people of color, where we are going to reimagine, reclaim, remember our pleasure. Connect with us on Instagram and Facebook at InPower Institute. Visit our website, www.InPower for more information. Thanks for joining us, and we hope to have you join us next time.
Yes. It's time to heal, y'all.
See ya.